All right, so I am Sarah from New Directions in American Landscape. We are an educational organization dedicated to the art, culture, and science of ecology-based landscape design. And you are joining us for one of our fall virtual sessions. We're excited to have you here. This session is entitled Beyond Plant Lists, Creating Year-Round Robust Habitat for Wildlife in Home Gardens with presenter Sean McCoshum. We are um, happy to have you write in the chat box where you are tuning in from and what your area of interest or expertise is. And we want to thank our institutional ally, Wild Ones, which helps to promote the inclusion of native plants and ecological restoration into landscape gardening. So welcome everyone who's tuning in live, and hello, if you're watching the recording later. So the session will be an hour and 15 minutes long, including Q&A. So please type your questions in the Q&A bar at any time, and Sean will answer them at the end. It's recorded, and it'll be recorded and viewable by all registrants for 3 months through our portal, which is learning.ndal.org. And don't worry, I will send you an email with all the instructions for accessing that after the session when the recording is available. I'll send that email. And let's see, that's about all my notes for the beginning. So I will introduce Sean. Sean McCoshum is a conservation ecologist and certified wildlife biologist with expertise in pollinator and plant communities. His published works include scientific, peer-reviewed articles, educational articles and videos on insect and wildlife habitat, wildlife gardening books, and a variety of informational pieces. Sean has worked across the country collecting data, publishing papers, and studying ecosystems, habitats, wildlife, and insect life cycles to help build better restoration and land management programs. His expertise and experience brings restoration practices, wildlife life cycles, and gardens together to create robust habitats in gorgeous urban landscapes. And we're excited to have you on, Sean. I think this is such a cool topic because at NDAO, we talk a lot about plants. We're a very plant heavy organization, and everyone loves to talk about them. But just having all of these other elements that are so vital to the importance of habitat and supporting other life is just, I'm really excited to have you here to talk about it. So thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I will go ahead and share my screen, and we can start off with a very in-depth conversation on ecology, plants, and insects. So that should go through. There we go. Did that share appropriately? Yes.
Looks good.
Okay. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Today, like Sarah said, we're going to talk about wildlife supporting garden designs and maintenance. And we're going to dive right into the cursory outline here. We'll start off with some fundamentals of ecology, the effects of urbanization, landscape designs, and gardens, and then how to improve on some of the classical design elements, native plants and wildlife habitat incorporations into those designs, and then adding structure and natural wood, mulch, soils, and stone habitat, which are important and often overlooked. And we'll wrap everything up with some seasonal maintenance, small scale disturbances, pruning, trimming, and sculpting plants, those sorts of things. And when we look at our gardens as small scale conservation units, it sometimes helps understand the overall matrix that we're plugging into. So to start off with, many folks learn about habitat succession from a model similar to this, where we're told that annual and herbaceous plants show up early on, and then those slowly lead to succession that allow a shrubland to form, and then having a climax community of forests, which some sort of catastrophe can happen and reset the whole thing and bring us back to the annual plant community. Although this is a very good place to start, and I wouldn't go as far as to say it's wrong, it definitely leaves a lot for wanting when we're actually talking about habitat. And that's because when that catastrophe happens, it doesn't simply reset everything. It actually allows the plant community to start over because our trees have died, but those trees to leave standing wood, they're going to leave fallen logs, The soils, the fungi, the seed banks, they're all going to be different. So although the plant community might restart from the overall structure, it's really a very different habitat than what we were shown in the first model. And another way to look at this is the original model really is what our plant lists are talking about. And when we want to talk about like a meadow habitat or a forest habitat, we really need to think about the non-plant features as well. Most gardens that are trying to promote pollinators or have really nice colorful flower designs typically focus on the meadow, shrubland, or forest edge kind of habitat. So we can zoom in on that and still understand that in the natural progression of things, when a meadow is formed in a forested ecosystem, there should be fresh standing live wood and down snags that are both new and old from the forest when it was still growing and being healthy. Trees and branches would have fallen, so you would have different stages of decomposition. And as time moves back into that shrubland in the natural succession of things, this wood would be decomposing, and the wildlife that live in these pollinator vegetation habitats that we're trying to recreate in our gardens are also dependent on these different structures that should be present in the landscape as well. In addition to that, there are all of the ecosystem engineers and large wildlife that are typically extirpated from our urban environments. And they're important to consider as well because they're out browsing plants, which is a form of pruning them. They help spread seeds. They're affecting nutrient cycles. They're also affecting the hydrology and creating burrows, which create shelter for other wildlife. They affect prey behaviors. And if we want to take a look at a real life environment of that happening, we can see here from a meadow in New Hampshire that this is where a fire had passed through, a small one, about 4 years prior to this picture. And some of the forest had passed away, but you can see it's very quickly regenerating on the sides. And this photo doesn't show it, but there are downed logs in here, there's downed wood here. And if we imagine just putting our property boundaries somewhere in this landscape, we're only going to be able to recreate a certain amount of square footage. But it's important to understand that even if we were able to capture this plant community perfectly, the wildlife that would be interacting with that acre would still be dependent on the landscape matrix around it. So we have to look at our yards in urban landscapes and suburban areas as they fit in the landscape as well. Another important takeaway from the ecosystem model that includes habitat is that there is always going to be transient vegetation communities over time, meaning that if we were to look at the same acre over 1,000 years, that acre would experience forests, it would experience shrublands, it would experience meadows at different points. But over time, that would be shifting, and the animals that live in those vegetation communities would also have to shift through the landscape as well. Some of this shifting is driven by small scale sporadic events like isolated rainfall or isolated droughts, but we also have landscape level over wet years and drought years. There are very different intensities of fire that are going to affect both forests and grasslands. Then there are pest outbreaks, floods, etc. So all these different types of disturbances quickly make how habitats form pretty nebulous, and that allows us a lot of freedom when we're designing our urban ecosystems so that we don't have to perfectly mimic one certain process and understand that there are different ways meadows and shrublands can come into existence. Another aspect to pay attention to is that the natural ecosystems and that transient vegetation cycle is often interrupted when we start looking at what we're managing, and this includes our gardens. And we manage a lot of our systems, even our wild areas, to suspend that plant and habitat succession so that we maintain forests as forests, meadows as meadows, and so forth. And we do this by removing or regulating the interval of disturbance. We tend to prioritize the vegetation community over the ecosystem and over the habitat, which is more recently becoming a conversation on how to make better habitat and not just focus on the plant community. Because when we focus on plant communities, that allows habitats to degrade and the wildlife populations not to move around. So the picture that you're looking at here is of Lee Meadows in Nevada. It's on Mount Charleston, and I worked here in 2011. part of the work that we were doing here was trying to restore this meadow to bring back the Mount Charleston blue butterfly, and its host plant that should have been abundant in this meadow was no longer present, and neither were any of the nectar plants that it was known to use. And this is really what started to kick my brain into thinking about, how a habitat ends up degrading if we're not really paying attention to managing it from the ecosystem point of view. And you can see that this meadow does not have any trees in it, doesn't have any dead wood, it doesn't have any branches, and that's because it's been maintained as a meadow for 100 years. In addition to those problems alone, there's now invasive species there. There are cattle grazing there. There are horses up there that shouldn't be. But this meadow is really just turning into a nutrient depleted area with just a few plants being able to hold on in the area that's managed as a meadow. In comparison, this is a meadow in a very similar situation that was recovering from a fire from 12 years prior. And you can see that there's a lot of ericomeria, there's a lot of rabbit brush in there, and grasses that are tall. That vegetation is about 3 feet in height, and then you have the shrubs and everything else moving in. And that's because the nutrient cycle was still fresh in this area. So when we're out in the wilderness and looking for inspiration for our gardens, it's sometimes important to understand that even though we're in nature, we're not necessarily in the natural progression of things, and it has been interrupted. And when we come back to our gardens, if we can step away from thinking about our plots of land from that plant list and really start looking at it from the wildlife that we're trying to support in our little areas, we can start asking questions like, where are they going to shelter for winter and summer? Has that been provided? Is it in the landscape? Even if it's not on your property, is it somewhere nearby? Similarly, are there microhabitats for the life stages? Like amphibians, many of them need water resources for a little bit of the year for their larvae. There needs to be nesting sites for bees. If they are predatory organisms like frogs or birds, are there prey habitat? Is there prey or is there food for the organism that we're trying to support? And that will allow us to shift from this plant list kind of design of a garden, which looks all right, to a much more complete understanding that can still be designed to be aesthetically pleasing, but support an incredible amount of biodiversity. A little bit ago, I was talking about how populations don't get to move around the landscape anymore when we suspend that plant and habitat succession and really focus on keeping the plant community there instead of allowing it to be more robust. And arguably, monarchs are one of the best studied butterflies when it comes to their ecology. And I have a few publications on them, partially on some of their migration, but on a lot of their predators and parasitoids. And during their life cycle, they're exposed to a number of different predators and host-specific parasites and parasitoids. The monarch is different in that if we were to just focus on these few species, the species that eat the monarch are going to stay in the habitat year after year. Their populations aren't migrating with the monarch, where the monarchs are migrating and moving through. So when we create really good habitat for the monarchs and they're coming back year after year, if that habitat hasn't been forced or allowed to grow out of the herbaceous plant community and turn into a shrubland, the things that eat the monarch are really just building up their populations. And a number of the meadows that I've been able to sample that have been maintained as meadows for more than a decade typically have really high levels of the parasitoids, especially in the south with these wasps, which can knock out the entire population. This tachinid fly is present throughout the range. I've never seen it reach 100%, but I've seen it reach up to 75% of local populations. And then, of course, you have Polistes wasps, wheel bugs, various ant species that will eat them too. So it is important to understand sometimes we really do have to interrupt the plant community that we have created in our gardens to create a healthier habitat for the wildlife. Similarly, there are parasites that we aren't necessarily going to be able to monitor for. And with the wildlife species, especially our native bees, there's so much going on that scientists don't have data on yet. But we can take some of the information that we do know about species that are well studied. So common honeybees, which are not native to North America, and bumblebees, both are host to the parasites Nosema and Cryptidia. So as an example of how this works, when there's a sick population, I'm going to walk through both the honeybee and the bumblebee and some interactions. So if a sick honeybee hive is brought into an area or a sick bumblebee hive, it goes and forages on flowers. That allows the nosema to spread. It switches over to a new host, be it the same member or the same species or a different species. That's then brought back to their hive. That hive then forages in the overall habitat where they are located, and that can spread back into the domestic honeybee. Even if we take the honeybees away, this population can now continue to spread the disease to itself and just have sick bumblebees year after year. Similarly, the hives, if they're brought to an agricultural area, can continue to spread these diseases to other hives as well as within their own hive. With the honeybees, the reason I want to use them is because the honeybee keepers monitor them so much. We know when something happens that we can do things about it, and there are prescriptions and best management practices to handle when a honeybee hive is sick. But when it comes to an ecosystem and parasite loads are really high, we don't necessarily know what to do, let alone know even how to measure it, because some of those parasites aren't even described yet or even understood. So if we rely on the ecosystem model and that there should be some transience in this vegetation community that forces these populations to move around, we can then figure out ways to modify our maintenance of the habitat to make that happen. When I was at Westchester Land Trust, which is in New York, one of the meadows that we were in charge of keeping was kept as a meadow for over 60 years. And it was fabulous. It was beautiful. But you can see it's overrun with goldenrod at this point. And goldenrod is a late succession plant when it comes to meadows. So when I collected monarchs and looked at the parasite loads on those, there was a very high level of parasitoids. We decided to start interrupting this cycle. So right after the breeding bird season ended, we went in and mowed 75% of this meadow because it hadn't been knocked down in any recent years that we knew of. We still left a few of the plants in the area so that none of the insects would necessarily starve, but it would kind of just start to degrade that habitat and hopefully force them to start moving out. The following year, we mowed the rest of it and did not re-mow any of the areas that we had mowed the year before. And this was simply just to bring back that disturbance so that these plants weren't present when the animals were emerging and trying to select habitat, in a hopes to drive a depression in any of the parasite loads or help suppress some of the predator loads for the pollinators that we were trying to really encourage in this habitat. So narrowing down to some of our gardens where we aren't necessarily trying to do acres and acres of work, but maybe, work on half an acre, have a really stunning design, we can still take natural landscapes and bring them into our gardens. And there's already a number of nature-inspired garden designs like Japanese gardens, cottage gardens. There's just a whole bunch that are out there that you can choose from. These designs typically build structure with plants and rocks. The plant structure is often modified with some sort of pruning, weeding, and then structuring which plants based on their growth habit are going to be in the front versus the back. There's typically clear borders like mowed areas, stone paths, rock walls, etc. And we can still lean on these designs, but there's a lot of room for improvement to add back in a lot of the key habitat resources that are often overlooked. So we're going to dive into those next. Some of the frequently removed resources from our landscapes include the soil diversity, including depth, texture, and slope. Quite often we try and smooth things out, make things flat, but that's not how it's supposed to be in the wild environment. Many different animals depend on or choose their nesting sites based on texture and aspect. So we do want to bring some of that back where possible. Of course, our native plant communities are often removed from our urban environments, which is why there's this push to bring back designing native plants. Overall ecosystem engineers, especially burrowing animals like woodchucks, groundhogs, which you don't have out in not groundhogs, prairie dogs, which aren't in the Northeast. But all of our burrowing animals are typically removed from our urban ecosystems as well, typically because people don't want to walk in their front yard and find a brand new hole. And that's fair. but a number of animals need those burrows for their own shelter. We also typically fill in caves, try and remove giant crevices. And then because mosquitoes are a concern for a lot of people, large, clean, temporary water resources are typically removed as well, or at least polluted. And we want to try and bring those back. The last thing that we can easily add, but is typically removed, is dead wood, woody materials like dried grasses, and then leaf litter. So let's talk about how to add some of these things back into our landscape. And starting with soil, building from the ground up. If you live in an urban area, especially where housing development has been constructed, quite often the soils are no longer natural, and sometimes they're not even enough to really support our native perennials. A lot of our upland perennial plants have really deep roots, like little blue stem, big blue stem, um, versus wetland plants typically have shallow root systems. Garden beds that are trying to support these larger upland plants, we want to make sure that they're at least deep enough for those roots to be healthy. Typically, that's a minimum of 18 inches, but for some plants, you want to go as much as 5 feet. And again, this is really only if you're in an urban developed area versus just your house was built on a piece of land and that whole land wasn't really disturbed in the process of that. And the reason we want to make sure that we have deep soils is because shallow soils can lead to sick plants, particularly for trees and shrubs, and they won't become a problem until those plants start to mature, and then they start becoming sick because there's stress going on with the way that their roots are interacting with the soils. If we look at a natural area, it's usually pretty easy to overlook the soil type because it's covered with vegetation. But in the landscape, as we're looking like through a river cut, you can see that there's typically a topsoil. There's nutrient deficient soils underneath that. There can be sandier soils where water has been able to sort different stones, sand, and silt. As trees fall over, they're going to pull up that nutrient rich topsoil and expose nutrient poor soils, which is going to diversify what's going on. A number of bees and birds will nest in fallen trees, especially the soil that gets pulled up like this. Fires are going to affect the overall nutrient values that are happening in the soil, as well as the soil invertebrates that are going to turn it over in those areas. And then burrowing animals are going to excavate nutrient poor soils, aerate that soil, dump it on top of organic matter, and this is going to create a high diversity of soil that's very easy to overlook. But on the large scale in the natural world, many different types of wildlife become dependent on these small resources that no longer exist. Another thing to consider is that natural environments have topography. And when we start looking at the way a lot of our restoration projects are happening, like here in the top center, the machines and the people in charge of this like to smooth everything out. And that can become a problem because the soil topography that happens is going to affect whether you have a fern fend and some of these depressions that happen in the Northeast. When the trees fall over, these nutrient poor areas, if they fill with some nutrient rich soils, become little nurseries for plants. Down here in the bottom right, I'm using a picture from the arid west because you can see through the vegetation on how just a little bit of topography can really affect the plant community. And out in the Chihuahuan Desert, wherein burrowing animal colonies disperse and those burrow cities pretty much start to collapse, or when large root systems start to decay, you get these little micro pockets, and they're less than 2 inches really in depth. But that little bit of change allows water to pool there, which washes seeds in, and then they're able to germinate, and you get these little pocket meadows throughout the landscape right after the monsoons. So when we're having a meadow restoration, it's important to understand that there should be microtopography at a minimum and not perfectly flattened. If you are lucky enough to have a large piece of property and you're doing a massive restore, here's some tips for that. Native seeds should be sown in early October or late March with a cover crop to help them establish. Cover crop is going to be something that is not going to grow back year after year. Typically, people use wheat, but sometimes they'll use a native plant, a native annual as well. Localized low points and hills should exist so that you can collect seeds that blow in and that water resources can help some plants grow versus the high areas where plants that prefer to be dry will be able to colonize those areas. If you're transplanting perennials, it's best to do that in autumn when daily highs are under 90 degrees Fahrenheit, but your first frosts aren't there yet. And this will just allow them to spread their roots throughout the winter and then grow back more robustly in the spring. Additionally, add snags and branches because they're supposed to be there, and they help collect wind-blown seeds as well as create little microhabitats of shade that keep the area a little bit more wet when the seeds are germinating. And as you can see in this picture here, there are actually different plants able to grow around a snag versus areas that were just in open soils. So if we're looking to create a really biodiverse habitat, we want to make sure that we're adding these things in. Another aspect with soils is that we can classify it with a ternary diagram, and that's by graphing the percent of silt by the percent of sand and the percent of clay. It creates this triangle. Typically in large modified projects, the soils become pretty homogeneous, but you can still find some areas that have some soil diversity. By adding in soil diversity, by simply just planting areas with sandy soils or amending different areas with organic material, sand, clay, all sorts of textures, you're going to create areas where animals are going to want to nest. Turtles like red-eared sliders, like sandier soils, loose soils to nest. Common snapping turtles like recently decayed wood. Bees like this Calides inequalis, which is a common northeast bee in the spring. These ones like to nest in sandy soils in lawns. So this is just to paint a little bit of the picture on how having undiversified soils can really be hindering the type of wildlife that are going to be trying to live in our little gardens or conservation units. Another good thing to understand is that when we've looked at ground nesting bees, which make up 70% of the native bees in North America, their nests are typically along the higher sand concentration soils or the clay concentration soils, and different species will choose different areas. Unfortunately, we've really only described about 400 native bee species nests out of the 4,000 that exist in North America. And of that, many of those descriptions are from one place for one species. So we have an idea of where they can nest, but we don't actually have an understanding of the range of soils that bees will utilize from a specific species when they're choosing a nesting site. An easy way to increase the diversity of our soils is as we're planning our gardens, if we put in rock installs or logs, we can modify what's underneath those areas for soils that aren't necessarily going to be conducive to plants, as well as in between plants where they can grow over the modified soil. We can also use areas around our houses, HVAC units, fence lines. There's all sorts of places that we can modify the soil to help the wildlife that aren't necessarily going to be involved with the gardens that we are designing. So for an example of modifying one of the current techniques, if you're using large boulders, quite often these are just set on the soil. There's a little bit of area dug out so that the rock doesn't roll away, but there isn't really a lot of consideration on how wildlife will be using it. So if we focus on this large rock here, understand that there's probably been some modification of the soil underneath, and the rock probably extends a little bit into it. There's really no access to the shelter that this rock could be providing by non-fossorial organisms, meaning organisms that won't make burrows themselves. So if we plan ahead a little bit, and also quite often people use weed liners. So if you're using a weed liner, go ahead and make sure that there's a hole cut in it so that organisms can still access the soil right around the rock. Preferably, don't use the weed liner at all. The other thing that can be done is you can put supports on one of the sides where the soils can be modified. You can then backfill this with some gravel, some larger pieces of rocks, wood, have these as tubes themselves. You can make little pots, instead of like planting a plant, you would simply just plant a sandier soil or something around it that plants won't necessarily grow in, but animals can dig on or at least move into and take shelter underneath this rock. At the end of the day, it'll look the exact same as the beginning, but it will now be amenable to having toads, rabbits, skinks, and newts living in your area because they'll be able to find shelter under these rocks. Similarly, since we like to remove the burrowing animals, again, which makes sense, it is a little bit of a human hazard, we want to recreate burrows as well because organisms like box turtles, toads, a number of different butterflies, and bees utilize these areas to overwinter in. We can recreate them by making sure that there are strong walls and strong ceilings so the areas won't collapse. The easiest place to install these is if you are building a raised bed, start from the bottom, put in the burrow, put in the strong walls, a ceiling, and then build around it. Equally possible is simply digging them out yourself into flat ground. You just want to make sure that the bottom has sandy soils and that water will drain. There are a number of organisms that already utilize drain pipes that are in retaining walls or French drains. And you can go ahead and use these in the burrow designs. We use it quite often for burrowing owls even. And I've even seen people use Tupperware flipped over and cutting a hole in those. However you do this, there needs to absolutely be holes cut in the bottom so that water can release. We don't want anything to drown. And then if possible, create sandy soils at the bottom or loamy soils on the bottom so that animals, when they are going into these burrows, can still dig out and excavate areas to make themselves feel a little bit more safe while getting the temperature insulation that they're looking for from the burrow that exists. A few more things to consider is that your target wildlife, if you're trying to promote box turtles, for example, the tunnel should be about 2 inches larger than your target wildlife. I would be remiss if I did not warn anyone trying to put these in that non-target wildlife will likely use the burrows as well. This includes black widow spiders. It includes, if you go larger, raccoons and possums. But again, these are important for the overall habitat. So when possible, and if you're adventurous enough, definitely install these. If you're really adventurous, you can go and create large burrows and borrow some of the conservation efforts that we use from tortoise conservation. Quite often, in areas where tortoises are being kept, keepers will bury the top of a dog kennel and then put natural resources in the front of it to hide that this thing is plastic and then cover the whole thing with dirt. We can do this to help promote foxes. If you want to try and have coyotes, raccoons, skunks, a lot of these organisms will utilize this space as long as it is insulated underneath that 1 to 2 feet of soil. Again, you want to make sure there are sturdy walls and a sturdy ceiling and loose soils on the bottom. We can also recreate some of these protected areas on a small scale simply by stacking rocks or creating little cavernous areas with rock designs that, again, toads, newts, bees, and other organisms can go ahead and use. If you want to try and create vertical soils that a number of larger bees prefer to nest in, it's easiest to do that in a retaining wall or with some sort of brick spaced out. I would not recommend trying to recreate vertical soils as a huge feature in a garden design simply because they will erode, they will fall, and they are a little bit of a hazard, both for the wildlife in the garden, the plants that you've planted, but for people as well. So be mindful when we are deciding which things to bring back into our garden and how it will fit with the safety of everything around. Similarly, if you are lucky enough to have a stone rock wall going through your property, these are a great place to just check if you already have organisms seeking shelter in these areas. And then you can add some of the modifications on the north side of the wall if you're looking to add more cavernous areas without destroying the wall or affecting the wall. Excuse me. Another step that can be taken to really improve the way that our habitat designs are working is in a lot of areas where irrigation isn't necessarily an option and we're trying to utilize the local rainfalls, people will use these volcanic berms around plantings to help hold the water there. And again, I'm going to show you a picture from the Southwest. simply because all the pictures I have from the Northeast have herbaceous plants blocking what I'm trying to show you. So if you're using this volcanic kind of crater planting idea, which does not cover the root ball, that's important, never cover the root ball. This needs to be exposed to the soil. Um, we can improve this borrowing some of the ideas that are used in urban environments, which has a support around the tree that allows water to still seep into these areas. And when we're planting, say, fruit trees or wild trees in the urban environment, one of the main problems that comes with it is trying to keep weeds down around the trunk. You can't bring a weed whacker in because you can harm the tree. Getting a mower in there isn't going to get close enough. So if you want to try and suppress the plant growth but still create wildlife habitat, we can borrow that volcano kind of berm, put supports in underneath it, like the metal grate and sand that we see in the urban environment, and then cover it with, then insert a softer material that animals can move around and water can easily flow through, and then cover it with a support material that is also pervious to water. In we went with rock rings. So place the rock ring, trim up the support material at this stage, unless you're building a path, which was happening in this picture, and then fill it with rocks. This space here can now be utilized by organisms that are looking for damp, dark areas, which include crickets, again, toads, frogs, all sorts of wildlife can utilize this space. And because the water is able to run through that, nothing's going to drown because there are spaces for the organisms to stay up and out of. In this particular design, the landowner constantly messages me when they're out watering, and the number of toads that they now see, the crickets that they get to listen to, where previously, where it was just lawn, they weren't really hearing or seeing these organisms. So it's really exciting to see a simple change like this that makes an aesthetically appealing point for their garden is a incredibly important shelter for wildlife and many different species of wildlife. As we talked about earlier, native plant communities are typically removed. So we want to incorporate native plants into our landscapes as much as possible. Dr. Talamy and his lab have done a lot of research, and their data show that we can have about 70% native plants and 30% non-native plants. Personally, I like having plants growing that I can eat from, so I like to include fruit trees and everything else. But if we're hitting that target of 70 to 100% native plants, we're definitely going to support more birds and more wildlife. But we still want to follow design architecture guidelines like the already nature-inspired gardens so that we aren't upsetting any of the HOAs that we might be living in or local laws and kind of sometimes confusing our neighbors where they think that we've just stopped maintaining this yard even though we're putting a lot of work into it. When we're choosing plants, there are 5 key characteristics to pay attention to, in my opinion. Those characteristics are the range and suitability. Many different websites and platforms talk about plants and their native status based on a state boundary. And in the Northeast, the states are a lot smaller, but you still have plants that are only going to exist in a very small portion of the state. So make sure that when we're looking at plants to plant in our yards, that they're actually within range of where they're supposed to be growing, and that the ecosystem that we have going on in our yards are actually suitable for the plants that we're trying to plant. For example, if you wanted to plant a oak tree, but you were already in a forest, it probably wouldn't go so well because oak trees typically need full sun. Similarly, we want to pay attention to growth and habit, the flower and the bloom period. So are the plants naturally going to stay low to the ground? Are they going to create really wild vines? These kinds of growth behaviors are important when we're designing an entire landscape. It's important to understand pollinator use as well as insect use. Is it a host species for butterflies? Are there going to be grasshoppers feeding on it? Are there any insects that we're trying to promote that might need that plant as well? Of course, consider if birds or other wildlife are going to eat the seeds or how they might utilize the plant, and then the response to trimming. I bring up the pollinator and insect use simply because with pollinator plant lists that are quite often promoted, purple coneflower is touted as one of these amazing plants. But if we look at the data on which bee species have been collected on coneflower, it's a lot smaller than I would think for something that's supposed to be touted as a really good pollinator plant. In reality, Echinacea purpurea is really good for honeybees, it's good for bumblebees, which are important, but it's also really good for birds. But it's not specifically a great pollinator plant when we are comparing it to other plants like sunflowers that we could be planting in our yards, or agastache, or any of a number of other plant species. So pay attention to which bees are going to be visiting the flowers and which ones you're trying to promote in your yard. Similarly, the response to trimming, many different shrubs and even herbaceous plants are constantly eaten and browsed by large animals naturally. And those plants that are heavily browsed and can tolerate it can be shaped into topiaries, can really make, eye-catching centerpieces for gardens while being placed next to other plants that won't necessarily be tolerant of being trimmed. And they'll change textures and everything else. So when you're selecting your plants, if you want an area to be orderly or organized, the ones that can be trimmed are probably a better pick than a plant that can't be trimmed and needs to grow in a more unruly shape. As an aside, in the Northeast, as many people know, deer populations can be really, really harsh on our gardens. And in some of the restoration work that we did in Westchester County, we were placing these large cages around the plants so that the deer couldn't get in there and eat them down or rub their antlers on them and strip them of anything. This accidentally came to the realization that when these cages were strong enough, the plants would actually grow to the sides and then the deer were able to munch on them. So we were still providing food for the deer, which is important, and that's what this plant is supposed to be doing, but it wasn't allowed to be overeaten by the deer and kill the plant. It was also immediately trimming the plants back, which was great because we didn't have to keep coming in and trying to modify these cages. So you can play with this idea in your yard as well with any of the plants that a deer are going to browse on if you want to try and change the shape of your cage to see if they'll shape the bush for you. Related to plants being eaten, anyone trying to plant a butterfly garden, the goal, really, if you think about a butterfly garden, is for the plants to be eaten by caterpillars. The problem with this is when a butterfly garden is really successful, it can lead to problems for our target wildlife species. So you want to spread host plants throughout the yard, or at least plant them in a matrix of other plants, at least one other plant that is not going to be eaten by your target wildlife. This is because caterpillars need shaded areas to shed their skin between instars as well as pupate. And if they're choosing plants that they weren't eating but that are still a host plant, they can be defoliated and then cooked in the sun in less than an hour. We don't want that to happen. Going back to the ecological model and habitat change, changing out the host plants every few years is also a good idea so that you're interrupting the parasites and the parasitoids that are going to feed specifically on your target wildlife butterfly and force them to move out while still creating a butterfly habitat just for a different species. So for example, if you've planted milkweed for the last 5 or 6 years, maybe consider cutting back that milkweed for a year and then having anise in for swallowtails. And then of course you want to make sure that you are avoid using pesticides there, and make sure that you're not planting on the border of your property where maybe your neighbor is going to be using a lot of pesticide. Pardon me for one moment. So another resource that is easy to add, and there's different ways to bring it into the landscape, are large, clean, temporary water resources. If you're trying to promote amphibians in your yard, you want to create deep basins with rough edges so that animals can crawl out. Even if you're not trying to promote amphibians, any water resource that you do have should have rough edges so that any animals, including small moths, that might fall into it can grab onto the side and crawl out without drowning. For places that have rain gardens, you can use native plants that tolerate inundation or flooding. And you can go to plants.usda.gov, click on the wetlands tab for a plant species, and see what it's ranked for your area. If it is ranked FAC, means facultative, or FACW, those plants tolerate being inundated with a lot of water, as well as drying out for a small amount of time. So they're really good for rain gardens or areas that are going to have seeps or collect water. Some examples of these plants are going to be your red maples, cardinal flowers, and swamp milkweed. You can also utilize your gutters and your rain spouts, put an impervious surface down, and then have a basin that will temporarily fill up. We want to make sure that these do not have fish in them if you're trying to promote amphibians, because fish will eat tadpoles and newt larvae. If you're worried about mosquitoes, there is new technology and chemicals called mosquito dunks, which specifically attack fly larvae. So you won't be polluting that water and killing all of the insects. You'll specifically be taking out the mosquitoes, which for a lot of people is an important aspect. So then that's why I bring it up. Preferably, you won't use it at all because mosquitoes are important for the landscape. But I understand if you want to get rid of mosquitoes. Another thing with amphibians, there are ways to attract them. So if you're in an area where you've got a lot of gray tree frogs and you want to maybe check in on them, scientists quite often find decent habitat for tree frogs and then place PVC pipes out and then just look inside the PVC pipe to do population surveys, because tree frogs love PVC pipes. So if you're next to your hose or you have a small wetland and you want to just check in on your tree frogs, feel free to stick up some vertical PVC pipe and see if you can get them to hide in there. With any ponds or barrels that you try and raise amphibians in, there should be some cover of vegetation, both for egg sacs to be attached to, as well as for animals to crawl out on. And if you're not trying to promote larvae of amphibians in your yard, but you still want to promote amphibians in general, creating or having rocks that have divots on top that will collect rainwater will promote soaking behaviors by the American toad specifically, but a lot of the other frogs as well will find those little pools after rain and just soak and get wet again. Dry wood and leaf litter are typically removed from our urban environments as well. But dry wood is really important for beetles, for stem nesting bees, for a lot of different insects that birds are going to eat. And they're easy enough to recreate in our gardens. The simplest way to bring wood back into the garden is to use log borders around our garden beds or create pedestals. We can also add mulch borders. For larger properties, mulch piles tucked away are going to be utilized by animals that typically would be using old stumps as they rot away, or old logs laying on the ground. Quite often, in the Northeast, when people leave a pile of mulch in a forest, they'll end up finding snapping turtles nesting in there. Stumps and wood can also be used for centerpieces, like you see in this garden here. A friend of mine in New York had a tree fall down, and this was kind of a mock-up of the yard of what we're going to do, where the tree stump roots are going to be left up. She's going to put in a pond and then plant all around it. So luckily, when it fell, it didn't damage the house at all. And I'm really excited to see when this develops on the final product. Another thing to understand about dead wood in the environment is that stem nesting bees, a number of them don't actually excavate tunnels. What they're in fact using are beetle tunnels, like you can see in this cross section here on the tree. There are there are bee houses or bee hotels available at a number of big box stores, but quite often they are too short for really supporting a bee community. And this is because the width of the tunnel is typically going to select the size of the bee. So your larger bees, like megachilids, that are stem nesters, need longer tunnels. So you can create these on your own or ask a person who does to build appropriate wood, bee hotels. They have 3/4 of an inch to a ½ inch diameter tunnel. Those should be about 9 inches long. For a 1/4 inch, they should only be about 4 inches long. Bees are able to control the sex of the egg that they are laying. And in these tunnels, the females are laid further back, and then the last 2 to 3 cells are always male. When we have a short system like this, that's going to shift the population to be male biased. And males and females don't always get along, so it's not a great thing to do. We want more females than males in our pollinator populations. So don't buy these. Try and find the longer tunnels or the orchard bee hotels that are actually designed to help bees and not simply make money. Similarly, bee hotels, bird boxes, and shelter boxes are mimicking downed trees, hollow logs that exist in the natural environment. So you can kind of bring back wood by hanging up bird boxes, wildlife shelters, or simply placing those large pieces of wood. As wood decays throughout the habitat, bees like the pure metallic green bee, I think that's right, Agrichloropora, these nest in the really decayed wood that you can touch and kind of just falls apart like sawdust. Bird boxes are mimicking the hollow branches and hollow logs that are found on both healthy and sick trees. Hollow logs are going to be important for mammals, including raccoons, skunks, and possums, for finding shelter and creating their nests, as well as reptiles. Peeling bark from branches, especially off of oak trees and pine trees, are important and common places for pupating moths and beetles. Decomposing wood, as I said earlier, is quite often used by snapping turtles, as well as a number of other organisms that are trying to find a thermal insulation. And then wood in general is typically food for a lot of insects, including a number of species of beetles. When we're talking about a meadow and bringing back that idea that the meadow is supposed to be short-lived and having this inundation of nutrients and things from the previous previous habitat that was there, we can start to refresh our nutrients by spreading a thin layer of locally sourced wood chips every few years. And I mean very thin. We're not trying to suppress any growth. We simply want to reintroduce those nutrients. You can also bury large logs and or wood chips in the area so that you're recreating that rotting tree stump that is important for so many animals to find shelter in. You want to add new logs every few years, 3 inches or more in diameter, depending on what you have available. Go ahead and spot mow areas where short-lived perennials grow, like black-eyed Susans or yarrows, just to help create a newly disturbed area and help prevent those late meadow succession plants like milkweeds and goldenrods from encroaching on them. At no point do you want to mow more than half of the plants each year, and you want to do this after the breeding bird period. You can do it in winter, you can do it in spring. They will have different effects. And then you can also add manure sparsely. And the reason we want to do this is because we want to maintain this kind of situation that should be occurring naturally. No matter where you're at, though, you want to make sure that we're identifying resources that are missing from the natural succession in the area that you live. Go ahead and try and keep those resources fresh as they would exist naturally. And also feel free to disturb logs, soils, stones, whatever. And this is because black bears, bison, elk, all these different animals are, when they are in their healthy, abundant populations, they're constantly disturbing these areas. That helps breaks the seal with the soil so that animals can run underneath those objects and still find shelter. Where if we leave them for too long, they'll form a really tight seal that worms and centipedes can utilize for shelter, but some of our bigger animals that are used to that recent fall cannot access anymore. Excuse me one second. So, if we take a look at just one of the many animals that have been extirpated from our environment, we can look at bison. And most people think of bison as a Great Plains organism, but they did in fact exist all the way to the coast of the Atlantic and into Maine. These large animals are going to or were important for dropping new resources of nutrients, creating divots as they would walk in wet soils that animals could take shelter in, seeds could get into, and it would also hold water. They are important for smashing down vegetation, which a number of folks don't want to prune or trim their plants because it will disturb the insects that nest in those stems. And although that's true, we also don't want to leave our plants standing in the spring because the plants that need to grow through that vegetation are used to having those plants broken, laid down, or squashed, especially by animals and snow. So make sure that at a minimum, vegetation is laid back down near the ground so plants don't have a lot of space to grow through before they reach the light. During the growing season, if we want to mimic the large animals and the way that they would be browsing, we can cut back herbaceous growth by about 25% once during the growing season. This is also relates to the idea of the Chelsea chop, which is an early growing season cut so that plants would bloom right before the Chelsea flower show. We don't necessarily want to have a flower show, but it's acceptable to trim those plants. It will also allow the plants to grow more bushy and be stronger in their growth than something that will grow spindly and then fall over. During the winter, trim back grasses and herbaceous perennials by about one height, and that will the material herbaceous material up that will support next year's growth. Still provide areas for insects to nest, and that material will no longer be a shading aspect that will prevent growth the following year. We also want to use natural fertilizers or teas to reintroduce nutrients like a herd of bison or elk or deer that would move through and deposit recently masticated plant material and provide nutrients for plants. If you're using mulch, don't use dyed mulch. Make sure you're using undyed mulch. Pine material is really good, but you can also reach out to a lot of tree companies that will gladly deposit a full truckload of mulch or recently chipped tree on their property because they don't have to dispose of it that way. Lastly, I want to talk about pesticides. So many people are aware that insecticides are bad for our pollinator communities, but pesticides include herbicides and fungicides as well. And when we look at the effects of herbicides and insecticides, or herbicides and fungicides, it's a lot worse than these pesticides by themselves. And the synergy of these chemicals interacting with each other is not only causing direct lethal events, but it's lowering the immune system for uh, insects that are getting a sublethal dose. And that's leading to less reproduction. And then we're getting the higher death rates over time. So both direct and indirect exposure is leading to a decline in insects. So overall, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, they have their place. They are an important tool for conservation, but they should be used smartly and in some level of reserve in our gardens. So just to wrap everything up, I really hope everyone learned something new here and got the takeaways that our gardens are going to be out of balance from the natural system. And that means that we need to step in and do some type of management. We can create landscape designs that have habitat through a thoughtful use of native plants, incorporating diverse soils, placing shelters, rocks, and water and wood, and then, of course, mimicking absent animals and the natural processes that are no longer happening in our urban environments or in our gardens. Native plants can be trimmed, shaped, sculpted for crisp looks, but they also need to be trimmed for annual maintenance to help create a healthy, robust vegetation community the following year. And with that, if you are interested, some of this information is presented in my most recent book called Inviting Pollinators and Other Wildlife into Your Garden. I have another book coming out in 2024. We're not sure what the cover will look like, but that will be the title. And I will gladly take any questions, or you can feel free to reach out to me on email or on LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Sean. So informative. We do have a couple questions.
Awesome.
All right. Sharon asks, how high above the ground do you place the vertical PVC tubes for tree frogs?
Great question. They can be placed all the way against the ground. You just want to make sure they won't hold water, so they just need to drain. But I've seen tree frogs like gladly accepting a piece of PVC pipe that was hung on a tree to help prevent like a bird feeder from rubbing on the tree. So it's your choice. I would recommend something that you can look into because that's what you are probably putting it up for, so you can see the gray tree frogs. But just make sure that they'll drain the water.
Celine's question. We often get wasp nests in our brush pile, and we and our dogs have been bitten a lot. Thoughts about discouraging wasps but encouraging nicer insects?
Yes. So wasps are a great example of what happens when things are really out of balance. So skunks, possums, raccoons, bears, they all eat wasp nests. And in our urban environments, we typically don't have those animals in the abundance they should be. Some of the easiest ways to discourage like an umbrella wasp, which are the ones that create the nest that hangs upside down and then they'll be found on the bottom, is by just simply knocking those nests down as they form. Typically, if there's only 5 to 10 cells, the wasp won't attack, they'll just go somewhere else, but you can knock them down at night to help avoid that as well. For ground nesting yellow jackets, those can be a massive problem. And the best way I've seen people take care of those is to put an electric bug zapper right at the entrance and just turn it on. It'll kill a few of your other insects, unfortunately, while it's running, but the wasp will attack it and they will all die. And then you can unplug it and move it, and there's no chemicals, there's nothing, but it's a really good way to get rid of them.
Sharon says, I wrote a natural garden ordinance for our city, but I'm having trouble convincing them that property won't just go to hell. What can I tell them?
Show them some of the really well designed native plants, but also like native plant gardens, but also explain to them that that ordinance can easily be written to include, clearly maintained gardens, and that you're not looking for wildscaping, you're looking for native plant incorporation. So Asclepias tuberosa is a fantastic plant to kind of convince people that we should use native plants. Short growing, very stout, beautiful orange flowers when it's ready to go. Sunflowers, people love to grow them, and there's a lot of different varieties. All those varieties aren't necessarily the natural kind, big, beautiful flowers, but they can get floppy. So you can explain simply by trimming and making things orderly that the yard look like a wildscape. They will look like a well-designed landscape.
And they have a follow-up question or a follow-up kind of comment. They want an easy way to distinguish between a managed natural garden and an unkempt one. So any thoughts on that? But you kind of are discussing that in your answer.
Yeah, so I would say try and add language about a wildscape versus a landscape and explain the difference, and then make sure that the city is on board with that language. And that should help them kind of step away from thinking or confusing, which a lot of people do uh, regularly, is confuse a native plant design with a wildscape.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Could you repeat the name of the tuberosa you mentioned?
Mm. Yeah, so it's a butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa,
Great.
and I don't have any near me. I was going to say, wait, I think I have some. I don't. It's out in the greenhouse. Um, Echinacea purpurea is a common plant grown at big box stores. So is Asclepias tuberosa. Blueberries are a good option too. Those are native, really good for bumblebees. Rhododendrons are native to the Northeast. Again, so there's already options in many of the big box stores that are native that people don't think are native. So you can also kind of illustrate that uh, already available product as acceptable, and you just want to increase the availability of species.
We do have a few more minutes, so if people want to type in any more questions, I'll look out for those. In the meantime, I want to thank you again, Sean, so much for your time and your presentation.
Yeah, I'm really
We,
glad you hosted me. Is awesome.
yeah, and the recording will be available. Thank you for that. Just for about 3 months, 3 months from today, so everyone can look out for my email. Looks like another question came in. Hillary, any advice? So there's two parts to this. Any advice about conducting burns on a third of an acre, or is mowing a better bet? Struggling with aster/goldenrod only, though they are great. And then the second part is, can native shrubs be aggressively cut back?
Both are very good questions. So if you're in an area that allows burning on a third of an acre, you're still going to want to mow. And the reason you're going to want to mow is you don't want to burn that entire third of an acre. So I would recommend burning the border or mowing the border so that you have a really strong burn break. And then just trying to do a light fire through there. The other option is your mow time is going to affect the ability for goldenrods and that aster to come back. So if you mow right as they're taking off, but right before or right after other plants would be seeding, you'll help suppress its growth. And if you do that 2 or 3 years in a row, the goldenrods will end up dying back because they simply won't have the energy to keep coming back from their root stores to help break them apart. There was a second part to that question.
Oh, yes. Can native shrubs be aggressively cut back?
So it depends on the shrub. Rhododendrons, no, they do not like being cut back aggressively. Blueberries, yeah, you can shape blueberries into perfect spheres, and in my experience, like high bush blueberry, you can cut it, trim it, cut it back 50%, and it'll grow back. It'll be great. If you cut back a rhododendron 50%, it will typically kill those aerial branches and then regrow from the crowns. But I would like to open that up to anyone in the chat as well who might have some feedback about other shrub species that tolerate trimming or respond their responses to trimming.
Hillary asked about after that first part, viburnum and gray dogwood.
As a question, do they respond well? Is that the question?
Yeah, I guess how they would respond. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have not worked with gray dogwood, and it would depend on your species of viburnum. I know the maple leaf viburnum does pretty well with trimming. I've definitely had deer take out like massive amounts of the shrub, and they grew back just fine. But I don't know about the gray dogwood. But I never worked with those.
We have a question from Linda. I have a native plant garden surrounded by quote unquote lawn deserts. Is this detrimental to wildlife? Nowhere to go.
So with the wildlife that are going to make it to your garden, it's not that those lawns are going to be detrimental, but it's going to be a filter of what makes it to your property. You can of course try and convince some of your neighbors to plant a few native plants in their hopefully plant garden beds if they have any, or like shrubberies. But if you can't, it's okay. I would recommend, though, if you have any host plants for butterflies, moving those into the interior of your property just so you don't get any insecticide drift or fungicide drift from the way that they're maintaining their lawns. Bluebirds, however, if you have bluebird boxes, put them up near your property line. They love mowed areas. So you would actually be creating decent habitat for those.
That's really helpful. It looks like I don't see any more questions right now. I'll also mention that our next virtual session is coming up this Tuesday. It's called Practicing New Naturalism, Site-Specific Plantings and Wild Gardening in Public and Private Places. It's with award-winning author and plantsman Kelly Norris. So we're looking forward to that. And then also, just if you're watching this after the fact, know that you can you can register for 3 months and watch the recordings of our fall virtual series. Feel free to sign up for our email list as we announce new programming that way. And if you would please complete the evaluation form for this program, it would be great. We have it in our portal as well as linked from the email that I'll send after the program. We got another question, if you don't mind, Sean.
Oh yeah,
Sharon asks, people are used to maintaining lawns, not gardens. How to help them transition?
that's a good question. Um, so people who are used to maintaining lawns in most circumstances are also used to maintaining some sort of garden bed in the landscape. Very rarely have I come across somebody who has 100% lawn. Surprisingly, they're out here in the desert, but when I was in the Northeast, most people still had some hedges or hedgerows. So you can start by kind of getting people to think about those planter beds and then asking them or encouraging them to add more planter beds to their landscape and sell it. Like, don't you want like a big burst of color in the spring where you can see the bluebells blooming, or in the fall and have sunflowers? And there's a lot of ways to get people to kind of step away from the lawn. And then just also mention like how much work a lawn is to keep. It's like mowing every week. It's expensive. So the less that you have to do that, and the more that you have like a once a year kind of maintenance schedule. I personally, I'd be more willing to do something if you sold me on less work. So yeah, I would recommend starting that conversation, looking at their yard, seeing if they have planter beds, and then encouraging them to add natives to those planter beds or building more planter beds. Not just ripping out the lawn. That's a huge process. So yeah, ease them into it.
Yeah, slow steps, baby steps, maybe. And then it looks like one last question in the chat. Any articles of yours you can point us to? I know you mentioned your book and one that's coming out.
Yeah, so if you type in my last name, it is pretty unique. Unfortunately, you will pull up a lot of arrest records from family I've never met. But if you type in Sean McCoshum, it'll on Google Scholar, all of my articles will show up. If you type it into Amazon, my book will show up. And I think they're all freely available. If they're not, email me and I can send them to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Sean, for your time and presentation. This was great, and I think we learned a lot. So I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Sarah. And you'll have a great night.
Have a great night, everyone. Thanks for joining.